Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to another episode of Random Trek. I am your intrepid first officer, running the Mythical Noir. Our captain is on an away mission and is not able to join us today. So I will be in charge of this episode. But I am not alone. Um, Back to the show is our good friend Scott, who has been with it. Probably the reason why I like Star Trek is, and Scott, but joining us is not just Scott, but his dad, Ken. And I have had the privilege of knowing these two guys for 33 years, and I'm very, very excited to have them on our show. So welcome, Scott and Ken.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Howdy.
Yes, and today we got a big one for you. It's our movie night of the month, and the film that we have chosen this month is one of my favorite films of all time. That is the 1990 political thriller, The Hunt for Red October. The film is one of, I think, the great thrillers of modern cinema, and based on the novel of the same name by Tom Clancy. Um, it's what you might call a techno thriller. We'll get into that in a minute. But what we always like to do here is begin by talking about how you came to this film. So, Ken, we'll start with you. How did you
Okay.
first come to this movie?
I saw it in theaters in 1990.
Nice. Have you read the novel before?
I have not, but I've seen the
Interesting.
movie many times.
Mm-hmm. So you got to see it there in the theater. I think Scott and I would have been just too young to have caught it in the theater. I'm going to
Um,
assume.
I'd already started seeing movies in theaters, but I don't think my parents would have let me see that one, even though it was rated PG.
Yeah, might have been a little much. So, Scott, how did you come to this film?
I think my dad introduced it to me somewhere along the way, and I think I first saw it when I was 14, if I remember correctly, while I was doing research for a science project
Oh,
at school.
interesting.
The project, at my dad's suggestion, was a demonstration of how a submarine works.
Oh, very nice.
And I think the movie happened to be on while I was working on that, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I would have been about the same age when I first saw it. Very interesting. So my grandpa Jim, my dad's dad, um, he and I were not very similar. Our personalities are very different. But he had been in the Navy in the late 50s and early 60s, which students of history will remember as maybe the closest the world ever got to a nuclear war. My grandfather was in the Navy during that time, on a submarine. And so this was one of his favorite films. And it's also one of mine. So that is one thing we share. I probably first saw this film. I think the first scene I ever saw, I think it was on television, was the helicopter attempting to get Jack Ryan on the Dallas. That moment, and I thought I would have been probably 14 or 15, and I saw that moment and was like, wow, what is this? This is really neat. And I don't think I saw it all the way through till I was in my 20s, but ever since then I keep going back to it because it is a marvelous film in so many ways. So now we're going to get into it. So, as usual, we're going to break it down by category. The first thing is the plot, and there's a lot of plot in this film. But to sort of simplify it, Captain Marco Ramius of the Soviet submarine Red October defies orders and heads out to sea. It's up to CIA analyst Jack Ryan to figure out what is Captain Ramius doing and get to him before both the American and Soviet Navy destroy the Red October. That's kind of the basic premise of the film. There are many, many twists and turns in the film, um, with Captain Ramius playing a very tricky game, a game of chess, as he says, where there's a lot of maneuvering and what's going on and who's on what side, and but ultimately a very effective thriller with a very solid story and plot. So, Scott, we'll start with you. Your thoughts on the storyline of this film?
Well, I think one would need to start with the political situation at the time. Um, See, it wasn't just during the Cold War. It was during a time in the Cold War when Reagan was president of the United States.
Mhm.
Um, Gorbachev had not come to power yet because the book was first published in 1984.
Yes, that's a very important point. Yes.
And it took several years for the film adaptation to get going. And by the time it did, the political situation had significantly changed.
Mhm.
Gorbachev was in power, and they were with his policies of glasnost and perestroika, and um, and the Communist Party was actually no longer in power by the time the movie went into production, and the Soviet fleet was no longer a formidable force. So that's why there's a disclaimer at the beginning of the movie that states that this movie takes place in 1984.
Yes, that's very important to point out because Brezhnev had died a few years before, and he had been the one to kind of keep the peace. But with him being gone, there was a power vacuum in which Andropov and Chernenko were the leaders of Russia, and nobody really knew what way they were going to take it. These two men were known for being very hardline communists and were not able to keep control of the country as well as Leonid Brezhnev did. And so that's when this story takes place, is a time of uncertainty. But later, when Gorbachev became the leader, things stabilized a lot more. So that's the context of the film. And yeah, you're absolutely right to point that out because that was a scary time. Um, I was not alive yet at the time.
I
Uh,
was just an infant.
yeah. So, Ken, do you recall what the atmosphere felt like in those years.
Well, it was a turbulent time because we knew things were changing in Russia. They were losing control over their satellite states,
Hmm.
and they had been during the Cold War a very formidable opponent in either an espionage or military capability and technical skills. And they had spent a large part of their budget on military upshifting, if that's what it would be. And people's welfare was neglected. And that was sort of part of the downfall of the Russian Empire. But the times were a bit turbulent, but it was nice having Reagan as the president at the time because he was a steady hand at the helm and he was to be feared in terms of our decision making and leadership. So it was fun to be here at the time, but it was a bit turbulent. Interest rates were high on homes. We had just bought another home, and interest rates were high, and inflation was higher. But you know, there was some stability, but you could tell on the international plane it was things were going on.
Yeah, thank you. What are your thoughts on the plot of this film?
Well, I really enjoy it because I like a thinking man's movie, and this makes you think.
Hmm.
So if you were in the role of Jack Ryan, you could tell he had to solve so many problems so fast to convince so few people that he might be right. So the convincing part is he had to be a subject matter expert in US and Soviet or Russian relations, but also to know the people involved, but also the powers behind them being involved. And so it's enjoyable for me in terms of seeing how fast people solve solutions. When they're presented with information, how fast they come to a resolution that is correct. For instance, when uh, Captain Ramius had a false uh, radiation leak, Ryan said it just made sense. And when other things happened in the movie, even Ramius considered other things, and he solved situations fast, like turning into the face of a torpedo. I love people who solve problems fast and see the issues quickly.
Yeah, the torpedo scene is utterly fantastic
Yes.
moment in the film that is very much about someone who's good at thinking on his feet.
Yes.
And we'll get to the characters in a minute. But what I find interesting here is that this is an extremely well written film. And it's funny because you, as the audience member, are not always sure what's going on. But just like Jack Ryan, you're kind of uncovering the mystery of why is this happening? Or why did that character make that decision? Um, what's really interesting, I think, is all the twists and turns in the film. I mean, when Captain Ramius describes it as a game of chess, it's like, yeah, that's exactly what we are seeing in this film. It's move, counter move, counter move, checkmate eventually. Um, and one of the things the film does very well is really build up the tension in this. So it was nominated for 3 Academy Awards, winning one of them for Best Sound Effects Editing, which I think is absolutely perfect because the use of sound, the use of it or the lack of it, is pivotal to the story as is the editing and the cinematography, because it puts you there, and it's a character. These things are almost characters in the movie. And the story, I think this is an example where every discipline of filmmaking is being used together so well that it paints an amazing picture. But now, of course, we come to the arguably, arguably the most important part of this film, and that is the characters. Um, Now, before we get into that, this is a Star Trek podcast, and there are several actors in this film who we have seen in Star Trek. Scott, do you want to guide us through what Star Trek actors are appearing in this film?
I can name at least two of them off the bat.
Okay, there's a few more, and we'll get into those.
There's Gates McFadden,
Yes,
obviously, and there's Daniel Davis.
yes, Daniel Davis. Now, Gates McFadden, to our listeners, she's no stranger. It's Dr. Crusher herself. Daniel Davis, many other fans, will recognize as Professor Moriarty in 2 episodes of The Next Generation, who is an extremely cunning opponent. But in this film, he has a small role as, oddly enough, the captain of the USS Enterprise aircraft carrier, which is a fun little reference. So there's a few others. So we have Boris Kurtanok, who plays the helmsman of the Red October, played the helmsman of the USS Excelsior in Star Trek VI. We also have Ned Vaughn. Ned Vaughn played Cortez Weller, who was one of the roommates of a young Captain Picard in the episode Tapestry.
Hmm.
And then, of course, we have Timothy Carhart, who many of you might remember as that jerk of the first officer in the episode Redemption, where Data took command of a Federation starship, and his first officer was a real jerk. This guy, Timothy Carhart, plays the commander of the rescue sub, which is a fun little Easter egg. And so there are several actors in here that have been both in this film and in Star Trek.
And
And
let's not forget it's the same studio,
it
Paramount.
is, that is right. And also Sean Connery was in contention to play Sybok in Star Trek V.
And that's where the name Shakari came from.
That makes sense. So we wanted to mention those few Star Trek actors that were in this film. Um, Now this is quite a cast because not only do you have Sean Connery and Alec Baldwin in the lead, you are looking at a who's who of character actors, including Scott Glenn, Stellan Skarsgård, Tim Curry, Joss Ackland, Peter Firth, Richard Jordan, Sam Neill, Jesse Jones, James Earl Jones, Fred Thompson, and and uh, and the ones that we had just mentioned. This is quite a cast.
Courtney B.
Bill,
Vance.
oh yes, yes, my favorite character in the film, Seaman Jones, played by Courtney Vance. It is an extraordinary cast, and it's very much an ensemble film. I mean, certainly Captain Ramius and Jack Ryan might be our main characters, but many of the side characters have great parts. And so let's just talk. Ken, your feeling on just the ensemble as a whole?
You know, it's interesting because I was watching a little bit of behind the scenes with Scott the other night.
Last night.
Was that last night? And so was how many people were in awe. I mean, the choices of actors they had were generally not the first choices except when it came for Sean Connery. And
Mm,
he was on the fence line until he decided, and then everybody was overwhelmed with his performance. And James Earl Jones was excited to be playing with him, and so was um, the character of Jack Ryan,
Alec Baldwin.
Alec, Alec Baldwin. Anyway, so I think it's fun to have that many good people in the movie, whether or not they had a big part or a small part, but all their parts were important. Everybody played an important segment, and so it's fun to watch the whole thing come together and to watch Scott Glenn say, "Hey, we rode with a submarine commander so that we could understand what he does,"
Yeah.
and fashions his role after that. And did a
Mm,
little research on that commander, and he went on to do all kinds of big things after that job on the USS Salt Lake City, I think. So yeah, it was a good done. It was well designed, character wise.
yes. Yes, and they always say that there's no small parts, only small actors. In this case, I think that the script did a really good job of making sure that everybody had something to do that was important to the plot. Now, it's funny because we might take it for granted nowadays, because Stellan Skarsgård is in everything nowadays. But at the time, here he is as a fairly young man when nobody really quite knew who he was. But in reference to my other podcast, my Star Wars podcast, we'll be seeing him again later this year in the Star Wars universe. So there's a lot of actors who went to do a lot of things, other films, or in the case of Brad Thompson, ran for president
Hmm.
in 2008. So quite a career and quite a list of great character actors. But so let's narrow it down a bit to the two most important characters here. Sean Connery as Captain Marco Ramius, Alec Baldwin as Jack Ryan. Now, this was the first film based on the Jack Ryan series. And Jack Ryan has been played by several actors over the years. Over, gosh, 35 years now. So, Alec Baldwin, a very young Alec Baldwin, as CIA analyst Jack Ryan. Jack Ryan, I would describe him as it's almost like this is too big for him. to do. As he says, he's like, I'm an analyst. I don't know how to do all this stuff. So it's like he's like, this is a big, big thing for this one guy to do. And I think that we get the sense that Jack Ryan is more of the nerd. He's more of a thinker. He's not a doer. And so getting in thrust into these crazy situations, and he has to trust his gut. And he has to, there's the great scene with the torpedo where he has to decide, am I going to listen to Captain Mancuso or am I going to listen to Captain Ramius? And he's smart enough to know that someone like Ramius is a genius when it comes to strategy. But it's interesting to see Alec Baldwin as this character who has to really use his wits to get through. So Ken, we'll start with you. Your thoughts on Alec Baldwin's performance as Jack Ryan?
He did a great job. I don't see anything. It's kind of interesting that, it starts out as a family man with his daughter in London, and he's doing his thing, the outreach with the Royal Navy and their spies and all these people, and collects this information and decides that, hey, this is too important for me to sit on. I've got to be on a flight as soon as possible to show this back to Langley. And I think he does a fabulous job all through the movie. I didn't see any faults in terms of how he played the character. He did a fine job.
Yes, Scott, your thoughts there.
Feel like Alec Baldwin is Jack Ryan. Now, I've seen some of the performances other actors have done in the role, Harrison Ford, Ben Affleck, and Chris Pine. I haven't watched the streaming series. It's John Krasinski, isn't it?
Yes, that's correct.
I haven't seen any of that, so I couldn't comment on that. But the other actors, well, at least Harrison Ford and Chris Pine, anyway, um, I thought did a pretty good job. But I still feel like Alec Baldwin is Jack Ryan. There's just something about Baldwin's performance that really embodies who Jack Ryan is as a person.
Yeah, I would agree. There's an earnestness to this performance, and definitely Jack Ryan is. Well, I would call him the American James Bond, but he's not really anything like Bond is.
He's sort of the anti-James Bond.
Yeah,
He's a secret agent, well, analyst, but basically a secret agent who is a lot smarter than Bond. Is Bond's really smart. We often forget that Bond did attend university and is really well up to speed on a whole bunch of different topics. But Jack Ryan has a PhD. I mean, this guy's really good at thinking. And unlike Bond, Jack Ryan is a family man, and yet he's willing to do what he needs to do to save the world, even if it means having to spend time away from his family.
yes, it's a good point. Um, the the interesting thing about this character is a lot of information about him gets revealed later in the film that he is a Marine, that he did attend the academy, the and that he was injured terribly in a helicopter crash that required him to have to relearn how to walk. And so this is a guy who's gone through some really tough stuff. But he's very, very brainy He's read a lot. He knows about Captain Ramius, a lot of information about him. This, of course, during a time where you couldn't just jump on the internet and find out about this guy, Captain Ramius. You had to actually read a book. Um,
Oh, the internet existed then,
it
but
did, but the average person did not have it. But I certainly
No,
probably could have used it at the time.
no Google.
Yeah, no Google for sure. Um, and so I think equally that Alec Baldwin is up to the task of playing this character. But now we come to the big guy that really are. You could argue which of the two is the main character,
I think they both are.
but we come to the person who, when people see this film, they think of, and that's Sean Connery as Captain Ramius. Certainly an interesting choice to play this character, but in the end is absolutely commanding of the screen, as he has often been in most films he appears in. He has a power to command your attention on the screen, and his role here as a Soviet submarine captain who has become tired of a war that's gone on for 40 years. Um, as he calls it, a war with no battles
Only
and
casualties.
many casualties, yeah. And besides that, it would be better to defect, and not only defect, but put the Red October out of the hands of the Soviets, because this is arguably the most powerful submarine ever built, with the ability to fool radar and with a massive payload of nuclear missiles, which in the wrong hands
Um,
could be used to
now that
great evil.
since you brought up the submarine itself,
Yes.
can we take a detour for several minutes? One of the reasons why my dad is here with us is because he's a big aficionado of submarines and could give you a lot of details on
Mhm.
submarines.
Yes, the Typhoon class Red October. Ken, why don't you share with us some of
There's
the
a
technical information?
sure. There's a reason I'm going to set a ground piece here. There's a reason why I'm fascinated by submarines because they're a lot like spaceships. Everything on the outside wants to kill you. If you're under the ocean 1,000 feet or 2,000 feet, if you come out of that submarine, it's going to kill you. It's like a spaceship. If you go outside without protection, it's going to kill you. The environment is a incredible force to be overcome. And there's more hull pressure on those submarines than you can possibly imagine.
Mhm.
Thousands of tons per square inch. So, like the Typhoon class is 574 feet long and 75 feet across the beam, which means how wide it is. They're a particularly unusual submarine because normally there's one pressure hull in a normal submarine and then a light hull on the outside, non-pressurized. Well, the Typhoon class has two pressurized hulls side by side. And they're designed, I mean, frankly, they're huge. The Typhoon class is 48,000 tons. By contrast, the Titanic was 52,000 tons. So it's almost the same size as the Titanic. Yet it has 100,000 horsepower. And the Titanic had 46,000 horsepower. So you can understand that the engineering that went into that submarine is phenomenal. When you think about what they have to do to design a submarine to have it function, the nuclear submarines, are just a marvel. A friend of mine that I play golf with worked on a diesel electric boat, Boat 313, the USS Perch, during the Vietnam War. He said they were cramped, they were stinky, they had to come up for air all the time. You could take a bath once a week. But his brother served on on a nuclear boat, and he said they had endless hot water, they had endless fresh air, they could stay underwater as long as they wanted, as long as they had food. They're really unbelievable mechanisms that are designed to live in the most inhospitable environment you can possibly imagine under the ocean by thousands of feet. And then they're able to hunt down their opponents, shadow them or destroy them, or just be able to observe what's going on. So it takes an incredible amount of people to run an incredible amount of machine. The the Typhoon class was really, really a huge submarine designed to do one thing. And it's just like the USS Dallas, the when was that? Would be the antagonist or the protagonist? I'm not sure which one it would be.
Opponent.
The opponent, and they are a hunter killer submarine, not designed to launch missiles like the Red October, but designed to observe and stealthily approach from rear and observe. But when you think about just how to have a submarine function underwater for that long under those conditions, like the seals around the propeller shaft so that water doesn't come in, like to be able to take fresh air in while be able to launch a torpedo at that depth, like just being able to communicate and observe what's going on around them is just incredible. A friend of mine worked at the U.S. Army War College in Washington, D.C., and he would be involved in war games. And for them, war games were interesting because they have a theory that if you send one thing, it's no thing. But if you send two, you may at least have one. He said he always won the war games when he put two nuclear-powered submarines on the bay on the bottom of the ocean in the opponent's area that they didn't know about, and they always won.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's such a formidable opponent. In the United States' nuclear triad, we have ground-launched missiles, we have aircraft-borne missiles, and then we have submarine-launched missiles. That is the strongest one because no one knows where they are at any one point. They are just unbelievable machines. And they only have about a 30-year lifespan on them because they don't need fuel, but their fuel will eventually run out and the submarine becomes useless after that. It's not really beneficial for them to take the submarine apart and change a reactor.
Yeah.
So you have technical people who are designed to do so many different jobs. And then on a submarine, just about everybody's trained to do somebody else's job because that's the only way you're going to survive. If you're a cook, you're probably doing something else. If you're a mechanic, you're doing something else too. If you're an officer, you have to be trained in all the other functions on the submarine so that you can take that job over if you have to. So, anyway.
Very, very fascinating. It's interesting you mentioned it's like spaceship because many people have compared several episodes and even some of the movies of Star Trek to submarine thrillers. Balance of Terror from the original series, Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, the Battle of the Mutara Nebula is like some of the submarine battles that go on in this film. In terms of not knowing exactly where your opponent is, but sort of leading to a cat and mouse chase. Now, the Red October feels to me like a character, as does the USS Dallas. They feel like they're more than just background setting, that they are characters in and of themselves in this film. Um, and it's very well done in terms of making it very clear which submarine you're on at which time. And that's difficult to do when you're editing a movie like this. It's really extraordinary to have these very sneaky moments of waiting to get the contact with the other submarine, which can be very, very tricky in this particular setting, as we have, of course, really one of maybe the unsung heroes here. And I'll just mention is that Seaman Jones is the one who essentially figures out how to find the Red October. The Red October is powered by something they call a countertiller, which is a bit of as it's described in the film, a jet engine for the water. And
Dad, do you want to comment on that?
yes, your thoughts on that one, Ken?
You know, that's that's a little bit of science fiction. I
Mm-hmm.
did some exploring on the Caterpillar drive, and the
Yes.
Japanese tried to do it once. Um, and and no one's really made it work on a large attack submarine or nuclear submarine, but it brings to thought of how complex they do propeller design. If you look at any pictures of the modern submarines, they always have a shroud around the propeller at the end of the submarine if it's photographed out of the water, like in dry dock. And nobody wants to yield up the knowledge and information that they have spent millions, maybe billions of dollars on designing propulsion systems for modern submarines because they don't want to tip their hand. They don't want to either make it easier for somebody else to do it or for somebody else to design a way to track them. And some of them are using propulsion systems, some are using these very sophisticated design propellers, but there is so much effort to make a submarine silent, including coverings, or kind of like a stealth covering that bounces off radar and sonar off the hull of the vessel. So propulsion is important, but the Caterpillar adds that layer of mystique to the Red October that no other submarine had ever before achieved, which is this stealth propulsion system.
Indeed. It adds to it is a bit of science fiction, but it definitely adds to what makes the film so thriller-esque, is if you've got this silent killing machine. I mean, that just adds tension right there. That adds suspense. There's a lot of what you might say Hitchcockian suspense in this film. Sometimes you as the audience know more than the characters, and that's part of building up the suspense of, oh, it's right there, that the characters don't realize that. And the reason I want to give a shout out to Courtney Vance as Crewman Jones is he basically figures out how to track the Red October.
Yeah.
And as the story goes along even further, you could argue that if Seaman Jones had not been so obsessed with finding the sub, then uh, the movie may have had a different outcome. Um, but the submarines feel like characters. And the Red October, of course, is named for the Russian Revolution, which occurred in October of 1917. And the Dallas, of course, is named after Dallas. And it's just so interesting to be able to make these vehicles feel like characters. That requires some really good writing, which they've got here in this film. So the next thing to move on is is there's a lot of spectacle in the film, not in terms of being like focused on this on the special effects, but the world building, the art direction, the cinematography, the editing, and many other things make this film work so well. But one that I do want to focus on is the music by Basil Polidoris. Basil was an incredible composer. He sadly is no longer with us, but it's interesting to point out Basil went to the University of Southern California at the same time George Lucas was there. In fact, many of those filmmakers, writers, editors, cinematographers, musicians all knew each other and worked with each other over the years. Basil, before this film, had done one of my favorite scores of all time, Conan the Barbarian, and RoboCop. And so he was really, really good at creating these pulse-pounding scores. Red October makes great use of choirs. It also makes great use of a bit of synthesizer and those kind of sounds. And yet again, I think the music creates a character of its own, and adds to the suspense of the film. Well, Scott, your thoughts on the music by Basil Polidoris?
This has got to be one of my favorite film scores of all time.
Mm,
I mean, they could have just made it a generic action movie score, but instead they took the leitmotif route because the
yes,
hymn to Red October, the
yes,
main theme, really gets me every time I listen to
yes.
it. It's sort of a I think it was sort of a leitmotif for the submarine itself and for Arrhenius, and even, admittedly, for Jack Ryan, who very much understands Ramius and
Mm,
has sort of an affinity. They develop sort of an affinity for each other over the course of the film, and the theme music I think really plays into that very powerfully.
yes, exactly. And I think that like the shark in Jaws, when you hear the music, you know that the Red October is there up to something. Yeah, or that Captain Ramius is up to something. Or in the case of Jack Ryan, that he's starting to understand, oh, I think I know what's going on here. Great use of a Russian choir, very kind of big, but also very. It's not overpoweringly big. It definitely creates this sense of almost an operatic sense of this is the Red October, and it's interesting that it uses the phrase "dusted onion," um, which means goodbye. Which, in many ways, you could argue that that is a sense of the end of the Cold War coming. It's not there yet, but it's on its way. And also the idea of Rania saying goodbye to the Soviet Union. Um, So you have that, and then you also have these great like synthesizer kind of moments that really like when Jack Ryan is being lowered to the USS Dallas. That scene, the music is very minimal, but there's one of these pulse pounding sounds that really make the intensity increase. Um, Ken, your thoughts on the score to this film?
I love the scene. I mean, when it starts out and it's pulling out of the Polyani Straits, I like
Mhm.
the music there. But what always gets me is when the crew sings together.
Oh, yes.
It's a
Soviet
powerful,
national anthem.
yes, it's a powerful
Indeed.
scene of leadership and commitment and togetherness and team building. I mean, can you imagine being in that scene where, we're going to sing together our national anthem at the top of our voices, and we don't care who hears us.
Yes.
And it's a very powerful scene about how tight the submarine community crew is in making that mission a success from their perspective. Now, obviously, the captain had other plans and the officers had other plans. And that's why Ramius let them sing on, because he was sending a message to the Americans. Here we are. You may not have heard us now that we switched to silent propulsion, but we're here. It's a powerful scene.
And it's also a sense of Soviet patriotism,
Yes.
which certainly was used to justify some many not good things. And certainly you could argue that with any national anthem. But it's an interesting idea to have the sense of look at us, look at what we can do, hooray for the fatherland kind of thing. And it's funny because we had the great scene where Jones says, "I thought I heard singing, sir," which is a great little moment. Yes, and one of the great things about a great score is knowing when to use music, but just as important, when not to use music, or to have it be very, very subtle. And I think the choices here, the use of the music in the way that they did, is brilliant because you get this very, in certain scenes, this very far off, ethereal singing. Then sometimes it gets bigger. And other times, such as my favorite scene, which is in Ramius and Sam Neill's character are discussing what are they going to do once they get to America. And the way that scene plays is the music is there, but it's very, very low. And it's more of those electronic sounds of the two submarines basically circling each other. Um, and one of the very subtle uses of music that still has a powerful effect despite how minimal it is. And certainly adding to the suspense and the tension of the film, which is this is an edge of your seat kind of movie. There are parts of it where you are like right on the edge. The final submarine battle. It's one of those that's just like you are on the edge the entire time because this is like a cat and mouse game that is now become like a matter of life and death. And there's other great scenes in the film that are just so pulse pounding that to me this ranks up there with some of the most suspenseful films of all time. And certainly Basil Polidore's music helps with that. The last thing we'll discuss is the spectacle. This film makes great use of model work, great use of actual vehicles, helicopters, airplanes, and so forth. And of course, real submarines in some shots. And also the art direction. You, as the audience, really feel like you are cramped in the submarine with the others. And also the lighting. The lighting really creates that atmospheric feel. And the the visuals and the editing is extremely good. And so are the sound effects. So Scott, your thoughts on the spectacle of the film?
Um, well, I agree that it looks very convincing. I do want to say that they did, of course, take a little bit of artistic license.
Yes.
For example, they said in the behind the scenes documentary that for design when they designed the interior of the Dallas, they kept it technically accurate. That is, where all the gauges and controls were and what they did and how functional they were. They that was all accurate, but the design, they said they decided to make it feel more like it had been designed by someone who designs aircraft, something like that. Make it feel a little bit sleeker.
Yes. Yeah. I don't think I'd want to be on a submarine. Seems too messy to me. Maybe too cramped. I don't know. But yeah, it's a good point that there is a little license taken, but I think that it serves the story pretty well. Ken, your thoughts on the spectacle of the film?
Well, I'm not really sure what you mean by spectacle, but I do love the scene at the conclusion of the movie where Jack Ryan and Ramius are on the bridge of the submarine
Hmm.
going up a river, and they're they're relaxing a little bit in terms of telling who they are and their little backstories and how the love of their grandfathers teaching them how to fish was
Mm.
something that they would love to go back to. Having eclipsed all the things that they've learned and done, they're thinking about family and how they loved being with their grandfathers fishing and they missed it.
Hmm.
And I thought, what a fitting conclusion to the movie
Hmm.
is that the two characters were really a lot more alike than we thought in the beginning. And their characters were developed so well during the movie that we really enjoyed seeing that part at the end. That they're taking this submarine, they're going to hide it, they're going to do whatever they're going to do with it, far from satellite's eyes, and how the plan came together, how incredible the plan came together with the DRV, with all this other stuff that's happening, the staged plans, the staged perhaps that it had been damaged or blown up into the water and that it hadn't been by design, but it tells a story about the depth of thought and skill and planning that had to go into it. And at the end, what are they talking about? Going fishing with their grandfathers.
Hmm.
I loved it.
It's a wonderful way to end it. Because after such a pulse-pounding movie, you need a few moments of let's stop and catch our breaths here.
Yes.
Um, so what are your thoughts on like the just from the visual level, the sets, the cinematography, just the look of the film?
Well, I felt like I was on a submarine. I felt
Hmm.
like I was looking at a submarine. I felt like, you know, this is kind of what it would be like. I mean, if you look at Remus's bunk, it's a small bunk. It's not a big bed. They
Mhm.
don't have big beds on submarines. If you were looking at the officers' mess, they are small and they're cramped and they have locking doors because they're going to talk. Um, they're always aware of who is around them. Um, it's it's impressive when I think about the technical accuracy about opening the outer doors of their torpedo tubes. Have they been flooded yet? Do they have the firing solution put in?
Mhm.
The the skills necessary to convince us that we're on a submarine with them as an eyeball, just watching it was
Mhm.
very good.
Yeah, there's a real good sense of geography as far as where you are in any given moment. And that takes a lot of skill as well. So, yes, this film, I think as we come to the conclusion, this movie really has it all. And really, every discipline is at the top of its level in this film. And it definitely ranks as one of the great thrillers in film history. And there have actually been quite a few submarine films. This one, as far as just the effect it has in creating that sense of you are on a submarine, experiencing what this might be like, and extraordinary in terms of writing, directing, acting, music, spectacle, sound. It all comes together so well. And we should also mention that this is the director, John McTiernan. Prior to this film, had done Predator and Die Hard. So certainly a guy who knows his stuff about a thriller.
Also ended up in prison.
Yeah, unfortunately, yes. It's unfortunate because I'm sure that he could have made some incredible films if he had kept going. But we do have those three films. This one, I think, is probably the best of those three. And it's one of the great political thrillers, action thrillers of all time. And so those are our thoughts, or my thoughts at least. So let's go to you, Ken. Your final thoughts on this film.
I enjoyed it. I enjoyed every time I see it. I've probably seen it, I don't know how many dozens of times,
Hmm.
but I always enjoy it. And this time I got to sit with Scott and watch it, and I really enjoyed it. And I took notes, and knowing that we were going to be watching and doing this podcast,
Hmm.
I took notes so that I could familiarize myself, and some technical research was illuminating. I enjoyed the experience.
Thank you. Scott, your final thoughts.
I enjoyed it too. And yeah, I don't know what else I could add to what Dad has said. Um, and to what I've already said. I think it's an awesome movie.
Indeed, I would agree. And it's a movie that, even though I've seen it many times, even though I know what the outcome's going to be, like any good thriller does, it still got me in suspense every time I watch it. And that is a real feat of filmmaking. And that's why this film, at least for me, and probably for the two of you as well, is one of my favorite films of all time. So that's what we think. And that brings us to the end of our podcast. Scott, Ken, I can't thank you enough for joining me today.
Thank you for having us.
Yes,
Indeed.
thank you.
Yes. So that brings us to the end. Thank you, everyone, for listening. We'll end the show as we do every show with complete, live long and prosper, and peace among life. Goodbye.